I'd like to now spend some time talking about what's a quite new and interesting area of fatigue risk management, and that is the level 4 controls. Level 4 controls, if you remember back from the diagram earlier in the presentation, are focused around controlling issues related to understanding and managing errors. If you think back about the diagram for level 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, what you will realise is each of those control levels operate at a point on a causal trajectory going from a theoretical hazard to an actual incident. As you get closer and closer to the incident, the control levels go higher and higher. So for example, if you actually have an incident at level 5, every incident must be preceded by an error. But not every error translates into an accident. So by understanding the nature, frequency and the profile of the errors that are made in an organisation which don't lead to incidents, you can learn a lot about the ways that you can potentially improve safety within those organisations. When we start to talk about level 4 controls and talking about understanding the types of mistakes that are made in organisations when people are fatigued, we get into some areas that are quite well understood in the human factors literature, but not particularly well understood in the fatigue literature. One of my particular research interests in this area has been understanding how people manage fatigue at an unconscious or a subconscious level. That is, what are the things that we do to manage fatigue without really knowing? And this comes from some work that we've done primarily in a set of industries where you are required to work even when you are fatigued. And there are a number of industries where that happens, and we'll talk about some of those in detail later. But first of all, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to some of the principles and practices that we have talked to up until this point. If we take those first 3 levels in the model, that is level 1, level 2 and level 3, I'd like to introduce you to a new term, which is to say that each of these are what we would classify as fatigue reduction strategies. They are controls, the purpose of which is to reduce the likelihood that a fatigued individual will be in the workplace. So as you can see from the diagram, the first actigraphic representation of the shift shows the ways in which we will reduce the likelihood of an operator or a worker being fatigued by controlling the amount of time they spend at work and ensuring that they spend an adequate amount of time away from work. That's a tool or a control mechanism for ensuring that people have an adequate opportunity to rest and recover and therefore are at a reasonably low likelihood of being fatigued. The second square shows us with our level 2 controls. That is, an individual ensuring they get sufficient sleep during their time away from work, and that will enable them to be fit for duty when they return to work. The diagram on the bottom left shows one of the fatigue detection technologies. In this case, it's actually the OptiAlert system. Again, the idea is by identifying people exhibiting the signs and symptoms of fatigue, then you will be in a position to reduce the likelihood that there will be a fatigued worker in the environment. And one of my favourites, which is the Red Bull, or for some people it might be caffeine, depending on your age and demographic, there is another way in which we can reduce the likelihood of a fatigued worker in the workplace. And finally, on the right, one of my favourite, this is a fatigue risk management system designed by a mining engineer. You'll see that it's very simple, very effective, and doesn't require a lot of training and education. I think, however, there's a whole new set of strategies that we can use for reducing fatigue-related risk that are quite different to those associated with the more traditional approaches, what we've labelled as fatigue reduction strategies. I think there's a whole new set of strategies based around what we're going to call fatigue proofing, or sometimes people have called fatigue protective behaviours. The idea behind this idea is, if we understand the kinds of mistakes that people make when they are fatigued, are there ways that we can re-engineer or redesign the system of work so that even if people do make a mistake, the likelihood of that error translating into an adverse outcome is significantly reduced. What I'd like to do is to spend some time talking about how that idea evolved and some of the qualitative research that we've been doing with a variety of industries to try and identify what are the things that people in industries where fatigue is unavoidable do in order to manage the risk. And in order to understand that better, I'd like to tell you some stories about some of the industries that we've been working with. We've been working with a lot of industries where fatigue is an inevitable part of the work environment. For example, if you're a civil aviation pilot, you can't stop the plane in mid-flight on an international flight and get a new pilot in the plane because you don't happen to have slept during your assigned break. Similarly, in medevac emergencies, people are required to fly people from long distances, for example, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and sometimes the emergency is such that they are not able to comply with the normal flight and duty time regulations. That is, they need to get that person to a hospital in a hurry. We have had numerous conversations with people working in the marine or maritime industries. Not surprisingly, if you're at sea and there is a storm, you can't decide to stop work in the middle of a storm. It's the same case in a bushfire. Sometimes, unfortunately, we are required to work extended hours because the option of not working doesn't exist for either pragmatic, practical, or sometimes political purposes. Nowhere is it more difficult to avoid fatigue than in a Defence Force environment. The picture that you can see here shows people operating in an extreme military environment where sometimes they may have to work 20, 30 or 40 hours straight because that is the nature of war. If we look at the B-2 bombers who operated in Afghanistan, their return flights from the US to the bombing raids and back often required them to fly continuously for 40 to 50 hours. In these situations, fatigue is an inevitable part of the work environment. But what's quite interesting in these environments is that people have learned all sorts of interesting ways to manage fatigue and particularly to reduce the risk associated with fatigue, but they haven't done this through the normal controls. They don't regulate their working hours as part of their enterprise bargaining agreement. There are many environments in which fatigue is unavoidable, and sometimes, as we talked about earlier in the course, a tired worker is better than no worker at all. In those environments, we've been able to learn some quite interesting lessons about how people identify and manage risk, and most importantly, how they use control mechanisms that aren't part of the normal, formal control mechanisms for managing fatigue in many other industries. The first example I'd like to talk about was some work that we did in the commercial aviation sector. We were working on some research projects with Qantas back in the late 1990s and early part of the 21st century. And in that environment, we were doing a study in which we asked pilots coming back from a long-haul flight overseas to do what we call a tag flight, and that is we would take them off the line where they had been flying, and having flown back from either Europe or the US, they were usually pretty tired, and then we would do what is commonly done as a work practice, which is to say we need a pilot to fly the extra trip between Sydney and Melbourne or Sydney and Brisbane or Sydney and Adelaide. It's often where that pilot would be located, and they would fly that particular sector as an add-on or what's been referred to as a tag flight. In this particular research project, we were interested in understanding how people operated an aeroplane when they were fatigued and what were the kinds of errors that were being made. So the tag flight methodology was used, but instead of flying an actual plane back to Sydney, Brisbane or Adelaide, the pilots returning from the US or Europe were actually asked to fly a tag flight, but they were asked to fly it in the simulator. And part of the challenge in that particular study was that people were asked to do a simulated flight, but unbeknownst to them, we changed the scenario so it wasn't actually a normal flight, and there was a small crisis that they had to manage. And what we were interested in was how people would respond to that crisis when they were fatigued. And as part of that process, we recorded hundreds and hundreds of hours of pilots talking to each other in the cockpit, extremely tired and flying from Sydney to one of those destinations. In the simulator flight, it was a flight to Melbourne, and we manipulated the situation of the simulation such that the weather changed unexpectedly, and it was a very close call as to whether the pilots could actually land or whether they had to return the plane to Sydney. We were trying to create what we call a goal seduction environment, and that was an environment where, because they were tired, they really wanted to get home, and we wanted to see what they would do in the circumstances in the simulation. As part of that simulation, while we're sitting in the back of the simulator listening to the pilots, one of the old check pilots, these are the pilots who drive or fly around and watch other pilots and to make sure that they're doing the right thing. Anyway, one of the check pilots had flown back from the US recently, got into the simulator, and then he turned to his co-pilot and said, "Look, I'm really tired at the moment. I often get my altitude and bearing calls wrong. So what I'd like to do is when I call out an altitude and bearing, i.e. 27,000 feet at a heading of 350 degrees, call those back, because I want to know what I said and what you heard are the same thing." And the co-pilot said, "Yep, no problem," and off they went. And as they were taking off, he would call out the flights and the person would call it back. And on one of the occasions, the co-pilot called back the wrong altitude and bearing, and the pilot picked that up and said, no, that was meant to be 356 degrees, not 256 or something like that. What was quite interesting in this situation was that two things had happened. The pilot had indicated to the co-pilot that he was fatigued, and he had instituted a very simple procedural change that increased the likelihood of detecting a fatigue-related error. That is, the simple transposition of the bearings 256 and 356 meant that the plane would have been heading in the wrong direction, and the pilot could well have thought he was somewhere where he wasn't. Similarly, if people make a wrong altitude call and they think they're at 25,000 feet instead of 27,000 feet and they get an air traffic control, they may not realise that where they are is in potential conflict with another plane in the sky. Again, the critical thing that we observed in our mission debriefs was the check pilot said, "Oh, I always do that. I always, when I'm tired, institute a callback or a check loop because I'm worried that when I'm tired or my co-pilot is tired, we will miss a bearing or altitude call, and a simple error could turn into a complex problem for us." And again, you can see that this doesn't require you to renegotiate the roster. It doesn't require an expensive fatigue risk management system, and you don't need to buy a whole bunch of fatigue detection technologies. By simply understanding what are the classic mistakes you make when you're tired and having a process for reproceduralising the environment in a way that will be more likely to detect that, you're in a position to improve the safety in the cockpit. A second example drawn from the commercial aviation area was some work that we were doing with Virgin a couple of years ago. And again, as part of the development of the FRMS, we were sitting around talking with the pilots and asking them what they would do when they thought they were fatigued. And one of the pilots turned to us and said, "Well, I have a very simple strategy. I know that when I'm really tired and I have a lot of complex landing calculations to do, I just start preparation for top of descent a little bit early." Now, if you're not aware of it, but top of descent in most flights is commenced 20 minutes before the nominal landing time. And in that period of time, the pilot and the co-pilot are required to undertake a whole bunch of calculations about what the weight of the plane is, how much fuel they've got, what the wind direction is, what the landing speeds will be, how long they need to pull up on the run road. They have lots of tables and stuff to do it, but it's a complex decision and it takes some time amongst a lot of other things that are going on. As you remember back from earlier in the course, we talked about one of the key factors that influences task performance when you're fatigued is whether the task is self-paced or externally paced. If a task is externally paced, as it would be in the case of having it start 20 minutes before touchdown, then the effects of fatigue are much greater because the time pressure means that you have to do things with your brain operating slower, and as a result the opportunity for error and having to back up and redo things is higher, and because you can't change the pace of the task, then the potential to get into a difficult situation is higher. On the other hand, where you can adjust the timing of the task, and one of the most systematic ways that people will manage fatigue is to slow down a task and take more care. What we'll see in a situation where people are able to slow down, that is, they will protect their behaviour and make fewer errors. The difficulty, however, for the pilots was that traditionally top of descent is always started 20 minutes early, and that makes it into an externally paced task. What this pilot had done is said, I just do all my calculations early. That is, he said, when I'm tired, I start the task earlier in order to allow myself 25 or 30 minutes to do it, so I don't get rushed having to do it in 20 minutes feeling fatigued. Again, this is a really good example of a fatigue proofing or protective behaviour. What the individual has done in this case is to convert the task from an externally paced to an internally paced task. And most importantly, they've done it with a very simple reproceduralisation. Let's just start at 20 minutes early. Again, Virgin were one of the early adopters of the prior sleep wake rules that we talked about earlier. And one of the things that they used in their control system was a set of rules for the fatigue levels on the flight deck. They went black, so to speak, at a score that was 8 or above. So they had a rule that said if any individual fatigue score is over 5, or the sum of the fatigue scores on the flight deck is over 7, then we will operate in fatigue mode. And there was a whole bunch of ways that they had reproceduralised their operations in the cockpit in order to provide more time. That is, they had shifted from an externally to an internally paced task. And this was really important because it significantly reduced the chances of error and improved their capacity to actually manage the risk on the day. One of the interesting issues about the effects of fatigue on people's performance is that as you become increasingly fatigued, the psychological tendency is to delay decision making. What that produces is actually a double whammy effect. By delaying decision making, you actually shorten the time available to make the decision, despite the fact that when you're fatigued, the best thing to do is to actually bring forward the decision making. That is to allow yourself more time. So one of the paradoxical things that we find in the fatigue research area is that people will make a decision to delay making a decision about what to do, increase the time pressure there, and therefore increase the susceptibility to a fatigue-related error. What we noticed in this case was that the Virgin pilots were aware of that tendency and actually intervened consciously to reverse the process. And again, as we saw with the previous example in the Qantas pilots, you get exactly the same pattern of behaviour. In this case, the self or peer identification of fatigue was a little bit more formal. The Qantas pilot turned to his co-pilot and said, I've just flown back from the US and I'm really stuffed, which is an informal way of signalling, danger Will Robinson, I'm fatigued. The Virgin pilots had a slightly more sophisticated version, which was to say we do the prior sleep wake rules and we calculate the risk and we have some threshold values, and under certain conditions we operate in fatigue mode, and one of the ways that they changed the proceduralisation of the cockpit was to actually start stuff early. Again, you see that consistent pattern. Identification of elevated level of risk, and then in response to that, a reproceduralisation of the environment in a way that reduces the likelihood of error. This slide shows the bridge on a large tanker operating out of Karratha on the Northwest Shelf. This is work we did with the Woodside pilots. These are the guys who will go out and get onto the ship and then help the ship's captain navigate the ship in through a narrow channel, park it at the wharves, fill it up with LPG gas, and then off it goes to China or India or somewhere. This is a particularly narrow channel because they had to dredge the thing, so they didn't dredge it particularly wide. And in the middle of the night, one of the interesting things about working in Karratha is it's very dark. It's really hard to know exactly where you are because there's only one point of light, which is the flame burn off from the LPG plant. But only having one point of light makes it very difficult for you to work out where you are in three-dimensional space. So we did a lot of work with the pilots here and talked to them about the kind of activities that they would undertake in order to manage fatigue, because given the number of pilots and the fact that ships come and go at all times of the night, it depends very much on the tides. And if anyone's been up to the northwest, they'll know that Karratha is an incredibly tidal part of the world. The tides can come in kilometres and go out kilometres twice a day. So what did these guys do in order to manage the inevitable fatigue that they would experience as pilots working in this area? Well, one of the pilots said to us when we were sitting around in a group talking about this, he said, I've got a really effective fatigue likelihood detection technology, Drew. He said, what I do is I get onto the bridge of the ship and then I count the number of empty coffee cups, full ashtrays, divide by the number of people on the bridge, and if the number is close to 1, then I know that there's actually quite a lot of tired people on the bridge. And while that may not be quite as good as a prior sleep-wake model, it again shows that clear process that people who have to work in fatigued environments have a very good understanding of the capacity to identify when other people are fatigued. Knowing that somebody else is fatigued actually changes the way that we respond to them. In the same way as if you knew the person driving the car was drunk, you would probably be quite on edge and quite attuned to any potential mistake. The same thing happens when somebody knows that the person they're working with is fatigued. So, what did these pilots do? They got onto the ship, and this had become a kind of a custom or practice that people would use to determine who was or wasn't tired on the bridge. And then what the pilot said to us was, if we've got a bridge where the crew is really tired, we know that the classic types of mistakes they make is that they get helm decisions wrong. That is, if we say 10 degrees to starboard or 15 degrees to port or something like that, the crew, particularly when they're working in English as a second, third, fourth or sometimes fifth language, struggle with those commands. The other thing they pointed out is that in many cases the people who are the helmsmen come from cultures where to ask something as if you hadn't heard it can actually mean a loss of face. So what they had identified was the classical error profile, which was the misinterpretation of commands, and some cultural factors related to the authority gradients that existed between the captain, the helmsman, and the pilot. So what did these pilots do? One of them had a very simple strategy. He would actually hold his hand out to the right or to the left according to how he was giving the instructions. So if he said, we're going 15 degrees to port, he would put out his left hand. He said if they were really tired, I would have cards which had 15 and hold out my left hand with the card. And that way he was able to visually reinforce the verbal commands. The point is that when you're tired and you are issued a verbal command, that command disappears into the ether quite quickly. And if you didn't quite hear it, you may get it wrong. Again, one of the points that were made by the pilots in this situation is in many cases they had Chinese helmspeople, and they didn't quite know why this was the case, but Chinese people had enormous difficulty differentiating between 3 and 8. Whether that's true or not, I don't actually know, but the pilots used to certainly talk about the difficulties in English language comprehension by people whose language was not native English speaking. Again, you can see the example of what they have done is identified through some form of formal or informal mechanism whether the people they are operating with are tired. There is an implicit understanding of the types of mistakes that are made when people are tired in that environment, and then a simple reproceduralisation that reduces the likelihood that that error even if it is made, will translate into an adverse outcome. That is, by putting in a simple check loop in the same way as the airline pilot did at Qantas, that is, call back what it is you thought I said. Now, interestingly, when we worked with this group, we told them the story about the Qantas pilot, and they thought that was a fantastic idea and said, well, we could do that too. The only interesting thing about working in the marine environment is that the commands all have to be called between the pilot, the captain, and the helmsman. So the pilot tells the captain tells the helmsman calls it back to the captain, who tells it back to the pilot, which introduces another layer of complexity. But the simple point being is that by calling out and calling back 15 degrees to port or 10 degrees to starboard, it ensures that the person who gave the command has a reasonable expectation that what was said was heard and acted upon. Again, this shows a very simple way of significantly reducing fatigue-related risks without the need to use level 1, 2 and 3 controls, which can be potentially far more expensive to implement. The fourth example I'd like to talk about is taken from some work that we did with the mines up in central Queensland. This is one of my favourite examples of how fatigue proofing or protective adaptive behaviours can actually be implemented almost unconsciously, but can be very successful in terms of reducing fatigue-related risk. We were doing some work looking at a number of sites in the Bowen Basin, and what we were intrigued about was that the hull pack accident rate on some of the mines was much lower than it was in other of the mines in the basin. And we're trying to work out what it was about those operations that reduced the number of accidents, particularly in the second half of the night shift. And it turned out to be a really interesting story. What we discovered in the mines where the accident rates were lower, they had a tradition of the dispatchers and the haul pack operators playing a midnight to dawn Trivial Pursuit quiz show. And what would happen is the dispatchers would get on the radio and then they would ask questions to people to keep them cognitively engaged. What was extremely interesting about it was when we talked to the dispatchers about how they did this, then they saw it as an exquisitely sensitive fatigue diagnostic tool. That is, they would say to us things like, oh, well, if Joe hasn't been talking for a while, then we'll ask a question that we know he'll know the answer to, or he'll arc up. And if he still doesn't respond to it, we know that's the guy that's starting to get fatigued and we need to do something about it. So what was really clear was that they understood that the loneliness of being in the haul pack truck on your own, the lack of cognitive engagement, meant that there was some potential advantage to be gained by increasing the level of cognitive engagement in the environment, and that they could use the questions in a targeted manner to work out who it was that was the at-risk person and who would be taken off the haul pack and put onto the dozer after the break at 2 o'clock in the morning. So again, an exquisitely sensitive method of determining who was fatigued and how to respond through a task reallocation to reduce the risks associated with fatigue. Again, one of the things that's worth thinking about here is that when we talk to the mines where that wasn't the practice, then a number of the mine managers had said to us, oh, we don't do that, that's inappropriate use of communications technology. That is, yes, on one level, it was inappropriate to be using the official communications channel to do a midnight to dawn quiz show. On the other hand, it hadn't been thought about that the reason that this practice has emerged actually made a lot of sense as a fatigue risk reduction strategy. And even though it may be a relatively informal use of the communication system, it may not be unreasonable to sometimes turn a blind eye or bend the rules, or to explain that this is an appropriate safety enhancing use of the communication systems, not just Trivial Pursuit. The next example is drawn from some work that we did with Queensland Health over the last couple of years. And interestingly, this came from some stories that some of the doctors had told us about an older doctor that used to work at the hospital and his informal method of signalling his state of awareness to people within the hospital. According to the stories or the history about this particular doctor, he would wear different coloured socks in order to signal his mood, and if he wore the Argyle socks, you better watch out, was the term that we heard from people. So again, this was a way of informally signalling his level of impairment. Now, we're not suggesting that Argyle socks be introduced necessarily, but one of the things that was quite important is that for many doctors, they're often in such a hurry, particularly in accident and emergency situations, and sometimes they'll be coming from a different ward or unit, and as a result of that, people may not be aware of how long they've been at work and whether they are fatigued or not. So for example, some work that was done in the United Kingdom on doctors' working hours and adverse events showed that where a doctor was going to a unit or a ward where they hadn't been working all night, that is when they had to go and provide a particular service or emergency intervention, the staff weren't necessarily aware of the fact that this doctor had been up for 20 or 30 hours. On the other hand, when they worked on a unit in which the nursing staff had worked, gone home and come back again, and the same doctor was still on, they tended to be much more aware of the fact that this doctor was tired and therefore engage in a range of protective behaviours around that doctor. We took that general principle of informal communications and not necessarily having the time to go through a detailed discussion of the prior sleep-wake scores and all of that with your colleagues. And what we did in that situation was to use the prior sleep-wake rules. And then the doctors had a number of ways according to how each of the wards chose to do this. But in the emergency unit, there was a big whiteboard where all the doctors' names were up that was used to allocate patients. In that scenario, there was a colour-coded button that was either green, yellow, red or black that indicated to the rest of the team what the fatigue status of the doctor was. On some of the units, the doctors had a colour-coded badge, and in one of them they had a hat. So the doctor would have the green, yellow, red or black hat, and when Dr. Black came along, you would definitely be on the lookout for something potentially bad. But again, it became a system for taking a pre-existing cultural norm about how to signal informally without having to use words, and then formalising it within the process that we had developed around the prior sleep-wake stuff. What was also interesting in this particular situation was the types of defensive mechanisms that the doctors had put in place in order to prevent fatigued doctors making bad decisions. One of the most common safety-related events in a hospital made by a tired doctor is an inappropriate dosage calculation. That is, sometimes you have to make quite complex dosage calculations that involve understanding the weight, the gender, the age, and a whole range of other factors, and those calculations are typically done as a mental arithmetic problem. And both the calculation of the dose and the creation of the dose through the dilution of the source medicine are potential causes of error. What we found that a number of the doctors had done informally was to use a very simple technique that where they had to do a safety critical dosage calculation, they would use either a peer, a supervisor, or one of the nursing staff to check the calculation that had made. The principle being is it's unlikely that two people would get the same answer and then both be wrong. So by introducing a range of these check mechanisms, that is double checking the usage for the dose, or as we found in some of the accident and emergency sections, people used to develop tables that made it relatively automatic. You could look up the age, the dilution, the concentration, the gender, and then look that up on a table and it would tell you the dose. And even more recently, we've seen a complete flurry of iPhone applications that do exactly that. Simplify and automate many of the typical mental arithmetic calculations that doctors have to make every hour of the day within the hospital. Again, these are all really good examples of how different routines can be developed, different procedural mechanisms can be put in place, all of which serve the purpose of preventing the error translating into an adverse outcome. One of the most interesting fatigue proofing discoveries we made in the hospital system was some work that we were doing with anaesthetists And as part of the discussion around anaesthetic staff, who, as most people may not be aware, who are required to work 24 hours straight every second or third day. If you are at the hospital for 24 or more hours, then you will usually spend a period of 12 hours on call where you'll be working on the hospital, and then you will spend another period of typically somewhere between 8 and 12 hours of what's called proximate on call. That is, they will have a room there where you can go to, and if it's not busy, you can potentially sleep. But in some hospitals, you may be so busy that you get no chance to sleep. In other hospitals, it may be the case that you get a couple of hours of sleep. But what has been noticed is that nursing staff always talk about the problems that they have in the hospital with proximate on-call staff who they call in the middle of the night and who they wake up when they're asleep. And they all talk about the stories about the doctor who fell asleep or fell back asleep and they had to send the orderly to get them, or when they asked them what they wanted to do, gave them medical orders that were complete rubbish. And they talked about the fact of how the physiological phenomena of sleep inertia or sleep drunkenness actually negatively impacted the decision making of doctors when they were awoken from sleep. We actually ran a research study a couple of years ago with one of our staff, Matthew Thomas, and he had a very interesting research protocol where we would call up anaesthetics registrars between 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning. And in the same way as nursing staff would ask them a clinical problem, we had a set of dummy problems that were, for all intents and purposes, a real clinical case, which they didn't know was anything but that. And then we recorded their answers. And then, interestingly, when we played their answers back to them, many of them denied that they would have ever made those suggestions from a clinical perspective. But again, as anybody who's been woken from their sleep and had to involve themselves in complex decision making quite quickly after waking, you realise that it takes your brain a while to wake up. And we were talking about this issue. Many of the nursing staff were commenting on how they found this quite problematic. And then there was an old nurse who turned to us and said, "I've got an easy solution for that. All I do when I ring the doctor up and they answer the phone, I say, 'Doctor, have I woken you?' And if I have woken the doctor, then I'll spend 10 to 30 seconds talking to them, giving them a chance to wake up. Then I'll ask them about the problem. And then I will recite back to them what the medical orders that they've given to me are and get them to say, 'Are you sure that's what you want me to do, doctor?' And by simply extending the conversation from 30 seconds to a minute to 3 to 4 minutes, that gives the doctors a chance to wake up, to get their head on, and then most importantly, I give them the opportunity to revise their opinion at the end of the conversation. Now, this was a beautiful, simple and elegant solution to what has been a terminal problem in many hospital settings. Nurses the world over will tell you about the bad decisions that are made by doctors having to respond to clinical demands immediately on waking up. And yet here was a very simple, elegant solution that didn't require the rosters to be redesigned. It didn't require the recruitment, training and qualification of 800 new doctors in order that they worked the less hours. Again, it's a really good example of how careful thought and the use of a fatigue proofing technology can be used very effectively to produce significant reductions in fatigue-related risk. This example was taken from some work that we did in the power industry in New South Wales. And we were working with emergency power line people. These are the people who get called in the middle of the night when somebody's line goes down or a transformer blows up. And their job is to go out and to very quickly identify the problem, and then in the middle of the night, often in inclement weather, jump up on the power lines and fix whatever the problem is in order to restore power to where it's been lost. I, in order to prove my masculinity to the team, had to go in and spend several nights on the line going out with them to see the nature of their work. And on one of these occasions I came across a supervisor who, when everybody got to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, would tell jokes, take the piss out of people, laugh, joke. And I could not understand how anybody could be that cheery and chirpy in the middle of the night. So we were talking about this afterwards, and I said, why do you do that? How can you be so positively upbeat, and how can you tell jokes and poke fun at people at 2 o'clock in the morning? And he said to me, the reason I do that is because whoever arcs up at me doesn't go up on the cherry picker. And it was quite an interesting story. Again, an informal mechanism for identifying the individual who's at risk. If they snap at me, they're tired and grumpy. Obviously, he would have to adjust that or normalise for individual differences. But nevertheless, he's used to working with that team for many years. And then in response to the perception of an elevated risk because somebody had arced up, a very simple reproceduralisation, that is, you don't drive the truck and you don't go up on the cherry picker. You can sit down and watch for cars coming back and forwards. Again, it required no alteration to the roster, no complex industrial relations process. It was just a very simple, heartfelt way of actually enabling people to identify the risk and then reproceduralise to prevent the error leading to an adverse outcome. This example is drawn from the road transport industry. We spent a lot of time sitting around with truckers, talking to them about what they do to manage fatigue. It's probably not hard to imagine, but truck drivers do work long hours, they do work fatigued, and there are enormous work pressures on them to continue to drive while fatigued. And given how fatigued many truck drivers are and how many miles they drive and how few accidents they have, it was of considerable interest to us is what is it those guys are doing and what can we learn from their approach to fatigue management? Well, we found there's quite a few strategies that truck drivers use, and one of the important lessons we learned here is not all of them are good. So, for example, when we talked to one group of truck drivers, one of the guys said to us, well, I have a very simple strategy when I'm tired, Drew. I drive at 135 kilometres an hour. And he said, I can tell you nobody ever fell asleep with white knuckles. And again, that's probably true. In fact, I wouldn't mind actually testing that in the simulator, and I am sure if we actually increase the speed to 135 k's, that would actually be a way more cognitively demanding task, and it would engage people more. And the thrill of potential death is probably quite an alerting experience. But while it probably reduces the likelihood of falling asleep while driving, it probably increases the risk of a speed-related accident. So in many cases, you've got to look at what it is that the individual is proposing as the fatigue-proofing strategy, and you need to make sure that it doesn't necessarily create risks in other dimensions. That being said, we have also seen some pretty sensible strategies developed in the road transport industry. Two of the areas are the use of increased communications in order to increase the level of cognitive engagement in the environment. So the use of the CB radio, talking to people, the use of talking books. The largest purchasers of talking books in Australia are truck drivers. So I think they spend a lot of time driving around listening to talking books, listening to the radio, talking to each other on the radio. And I can't tell you how many truck drivers have told us the story of being incredibly fatigued and sometimes just calling the missus and saying, can you talk me in the last 100 kilometres on the phone because I'm not sure I can keep my eyes open. So again, that notion of understanding the times when you're likely to be fatigued and then having some very simple practical workarounds that increase the cognitive engagement or the cognitive demands of the task in order to reduce the likelihood of falling asleep. Again, one of the most sophisticated forms of fatigue proofing that we've ever come across was explained to us by a group of people who work in what we call the remote area livestock transport operator environment. These are the guys who carry all of the cattle around in remote Australia. On the hierarchy of drivers, these are referred to as the turd herders as distinct to the tanker wankers. But at the bottom of the road transport hierarchy, these guys are not that dissimilar to the old-time drovers. That is, they will pick up a load of cattle and then 4 or 5 trucks will go out in convoy. And one of the things that was really interesting speaking to a group of these drivers once was they told us the story is that when they are driving in a convoy, they have a very simple strategy, which is they'll have a feed and then they will talk amongst themselves about who's the most fatigued. And the least tired person drives at the front, and the second least tired person drives at the back, and everybody else drives in between. And you might say, why is that? Well, if you think back to what it is we talked about earlier in terms of the effects of fatigue on driving performance in particular, speed and lane variability were two of the key leading behavioural indicators of fatigue in a driver. And if you think about what they're doing, by having somebody go at the front and everybody sitting behind them, instead of having to monitor the speedo, all you have to monitor is your relative distance to the truck in front. So if the guy at the front is keeping his speed on speed and everybody else maintains a set distance behind him, all of they will be able to do it. And the cognitive demands of having to monitor your speed by looking at the speedo is much more difficult than just having to look and keep a constant distance with the truck in front. You don't actually have to remember to look down. The other point was the guy who went at the back. And you'll remember we talked about steering lane variability. Who can see who's wandering on and off the road and can get straight onto the CB radio and say, oi, you're wandering across the road, and that may be the point. They usually keep a spare driver who then subs between the trucks as required. That person at the back becomes the steering lane fatigue detection technology. But it's just a person's brain, and it's a very simple feedback mechanism as they get on the CB and talk to that person. So again, that's one of the best examples we've seen of how a team both protects and self-manages in order to reduce the likelihood that even while driving fatigued, the chances of actually driving off the road and having an accident are significantly reduced. Before we try and wrap up this section around fatigue proofing and protective behaviours, I'd like to tell you a personal story about one of my favourite fatigue proofing mechanisms. And as somebody who catches a lot of early morning flights, particularly because I travel interstate a lot, I have to get up at 4 and 4:30 in the morning, and then I often have to catch a cab to the airport. And often that cab driver has been there in the cab driving continuously since 3 or 4 o'clock the previous day. And in some cases, these are students who are studying during the day, driving at night, studying again during the day. Sometimes these drivers at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning have been awake a long time, they're at the low in their circadian system, and in the last few years I've had 2 drivers fall asleep at the wheel while driving me to the airport. Luckily, both of them were stopped at the lights when this happened. But I now have a very simple fatigue proofing mechanism, which is I get into the car, and I say, are you starting work or finishing work? And in most cases I can tell the answer beforehand, because you can tell by the smell whether somebody's been in the car for 12 or 14 hours. But if that person says to me, no, I'm just about to finish, then I get into the front seat of the car and I make sure that there's a fairly continuous conversation going on all the way to the airport. Whether this is statistically significant or not, but I've never had a driver subsequently fall asleep. And I think in some cases, at least sitting in the front seat gives me the illusion that I may be able to reach across and grab the steering wheel, which I couldn't do from the back seat. Whether I could or not is probably a moot question, but nevertheless, at least the illusion of control keeps me talkative and chirpy with him on the way to the airport. So there is an example of a set of fatigue proofing or protective behaviours that we've identified from a group of workplaces over the last 5 or 6 years. What I'd like to do now is to take those general principles and try and put a little bit of theory around those. And on the slide that you can see here, you'll see we've articulated out what we call the metastructure of the fatigue proofing process. And what I think you'll find as the common thread that links all of these stories is that there are 3 key elements in the fatigue proofing process. The first step is that there is some process for risk assessing the likelihood of fatigue. As you'll remember from some of the stories is sometimes it's informal, sometimes it's formal, and sometimes in organisations when we're starting to think about fatigue proofing, we'll also think about how we can formalise the likelihood assessment using the prior sleep-wake rules and those level 2 controls, for example. But there is always this process whereby somebody either self-identifies or peer identifies that there's an elevated level of fatigue in the workplace. The second element of this process is that people undertaking the task have an implicit knowledge of the types of mistakes people make when they're tired. This is absolutely critical because every task will have a relatively different error profile And in many cases, you will only develop a knowledge of the typical mistakes people will make when they're tired through many years of experience or from extended period of time talking to people who undertake that task on a regular basis. The third area that you'll see is that there has usually been some process of re-proceduralising the operating environment. There are things that we do differently when we know that we or others are tired. And I think if you're thinking about this from a formal process, one of the challenges of developing a fatigue risk management system is saying, how can I take the informal processes outlined here at 1, 2 and 3, and how can I systematise them and formalise them within the risk or safety management system? And I think there's a very simple methodology that will enable people to do that, and the next slide shows this. One of the interesting things about fatigue proofing strategies is that they often exist organically within organisations, and in many cases it's about identifying and harvesting pre-existing strategies rather than creating and developing and implementing new ones. One of the challenges within an organisation is to identify whether there are effective fatigue proofing strategies in place, and in many cases it's just a question of taking those pre-existing informal strategies and making them part of the formal safety management system. It may seem simple and straightforward to identify and formalise the strategies that an organisation is using for fatigue proofing, but that isn't always the case. What we've discovered over the years is sometimes the ones that exist inorganically don't make the transition to part of the formal system because it kills something of their simplicity and beauty. Similarly, we have found that strategies identified in other organisations and industries can be inserted into other organisations in a relatively simple and straightforward manner. What I'd like to talk about in the last section of the Level 4 controls is the process that we use for harvesting fatigue proofing strategies and then implementing, formalising and evaluating them as part of the safety management system for fatigue. I think there's a 7-stage process that organisations go through in terms of identifying and managing and formalising fatigue proofing strategies. The first and probably the most important stage is to actually sit down and talk to the employees about what types of fatigue proofing strategies they are using. One of the things that we have noticed over the years, if you ask people what fatigue proofing strategies they're using, they'll look at you with an old-fashioned look and have no idea what you're talking about. We've found over the last couple of years that the best way is to give examples from other industries or other organisations of fatigue proofing strategies so that people grasp the general principles and then get them to think of examples that are undertaken in their workplace. And we find that that process works reasonably well. So there should be a period of reasonably extensive consultation where you sit down with groups of people and you go through those 3 stages of the model that we've just talked about. Ask them for the ways that they formally and informally identify whether people are fatigued. The second part of the model is to understand the typical error profiles associated with the tasks. As we said before, that formal identification of people at risk of fatigue is often done using a more systematic approach such as the prior sleep-wake rules that we talked about in Level 2 controls. Similarly, understanding the typical error profiles associated with a task is something that would be done through the Level 3 control process. That is, understanding how the task changes as a result of undertaking it fatigued and what are the typical types of errors that people make. It's important to understand that you need to do a significant consultation period here because not everybody has made every mistake. What we have found particularly useful is to use a focus group strategy and to typically assess up to 300 years of experience in the organisation. So if you've got 20 people who've been working in the organisation for 15 years, then you can get some idea of the relative frequency of the types of errors they talk about. So if somebody says, oh, this is a classic error that people make when they're fatigued, and everybody starts nodding, and you can say, well, how many times have you made that mistake in the last 10 years or 5 years, you can quite simply, once you've got 300 years of experience around the table, create some fairly reliable and robust estimates of the likelihood of those errors. Obviously, you can work out the consequences of those errors if they were to translate into an adverse outcome, and then you can go through a normal process of risk ranking those errors in terms of their likelihood and consequence for the organisation. The third part of the consultation phase is to spend time talking about how people have chosen to re-proceduralise in order to prevent the error. And again, in some cases, this is quite hard to uncover. In many cases, it's part of the cultural background of the organisation. That's just the way we do things around here. So sometimes people may not actually see fatigue proofing in the way that I've talked about in some of the examples. So for example, in the Virgin example, where the individual said, oh, we operate in fatigue mode, not all organisations will have a formal process for identifying whether you are or are not operating in fatigue mode. Sometimes we always operate in fatigue mode. We see that particularly in the healthcare and emergency services environments. But it's important to make sure that you have a very detailed consultation with people about those three elements of the metastructure on the previous slide, and then collate that information and start to make some sense of it. The next phase of the process is to benchmark what your guys do and to see what is done in other industries that may be relevant to you and what is done in other organisations in your own industry. You can learn a lot of new tricks from other people. And in many cases, if you sample a broad enough number of organisations in your industry or other industries, you can find a whole bunch of fatigue proofing strategies that could be potentially useful in your organisation. Having done that consultation and benchmarking phase, the next step is to identify the fatigue proofing strategies that are most likely to succeed and that will give you the most bang for your buck within your organisation. And there will be some process of then starting to evaluate which of those you will use and how they might be put into the process. The next stage of the process is to say, we need to formalise these as part of the safety management system. So you need to be aware that people understand how to do the risk assessment, how to identify the typical types of errors, and they understand what the reproceduralisation will be in order to prevent those errors going on to become adverse events. So having undertaken those first 4 or 5 steps, that is to consult, benchmark, identify, evaluate potential strategies and then to formalise them into the safety management system, you then have the last 2 phases of the process. That is, the next step is to disseminate them and to make sure that everybody understands and knows what they're meant to do. And then finally, not everything that you do works out the way you plan. The law of unintended consequence works very intensely in this particular process. We have seen organisations try to generalise a fatigue proofing strategy that worked in one organisation to another, and it just didn't work. Sometimes we've tried to generalise from one industry to another industry and it's worked successfully, and other times it hasn't. The general theory and principles and philosophy around fatigue proofing is quite new, and we don't yet understand all of the factors that determine whether you can successfully migrate a fatigue proofing strategy from one organisation to another. I think a useful way of thinking about this is an evolutionary model. Fatigue proofing strategies evolve within a particular organisational niche, and they often work and succeed as a result of being within that specific organisational niche. In the same way as you take a fish out of water and it doesn't survive particularly well, sometimes taking fatigue proofing strategies out of the environment from which they evolved limits their ability to continue to survive. So again, it's very important with whatever fatigue proofing strategies you put in place, 6 and 12 months later, pull them out, review them and see how they're working. And don't be afraid if they don't seem to be working to kill them and try something else. So, as I said at the start of this section, this is one of the really new, exciting areas of fatigue risk management. And most importantly, it's our guess that you can do a very significant amount of fatigue risk reduction through these fatigue proofing strategies, and it doesn't require you to address some of the big ticket items that fatigue management can. Changing the roster, renegotiating the enterprise bargaining agreement, all of those kind of factors have a high degree of inertia around them and can sometimes be quite expensive to implement. On the other hand, fatigue proofing has a number of advantages. One, it's cheap and quick. It's often a process of just formalising what already exists. And most importantly, our experience has been it sends a really important message to people. That is that you're really serious about fatigue management and it's not an attempt to put your hand in their back pocket. I've seen many organisations crash and burn around fatigue risk management because fatigue risk management is secret code for the overtime reduction strategy or some other industrial agenda. The other thing is that the fatigue reduction strategies, those are the things that you do at level 1, 2 and 3, often take quite a long time to implement and have very long lead times in terms of their introduction and evaluation. Fatigue proofing is something that gives you good bang for your buck and can be done quite quickly, and it can be used to build some rapport and trust with people that this is actually a legitimate fatigue risk reduction process and not some hidden or undeclared industrial relations agenda.